Right now, we've got a very special guest. We will have time to take some questions during the session, so if you do have a question, please queue up behind the microphone in this aisle here. For now, please welcome, talking about the thrilling and sometimes confusing world of virtual reality from Valve, Chet Faliszek.
Hi, I'm Chet Faliszek from Valve. So today I have a talk that's focused towards people who are looking at virtual reality but might be confused by some of what they hear. So a little apology up front. When you give me Elite Dangerous and a flight stick and tell me to go home and test the Vive version of it for inclusion at Eurogamer Expo, that's a good way to get me distracted from working on my talk. So apologies up front. Let's pull together me being uncomfortable on the stage and you thinking you're watching a live episode of Black Mirror on narcissism. We can get through this together. So, well, this talks about VR in general. I'll often reference the Vive. That's because many of our thoughts and many of the things we worked on are kind of wrapped up in what the Vive's become. So you can think of it as the end result of what we're going to be discussing. While this talk will cover some technical points, don't worry, I'm not really a technical person. We just really want to take a few minutes to clear up some of the confusion. And one warning, though, this is all really new. One of the cool things of working on this at this level is you get to turn to the person next to you and say, hey, come check this out. And you may be the only two people who have ever seen this so far in the world. So all of this is changing really rapidly. All of this is advancing. So there's no absolutes in anything I say. 6 months from now, something can change and things will be advancing. Okay. So the structure of the talk is going to be, let me give you a little background, and we're going to go over some of the points, and then we'll have a Q&A for questions at the end. So at Valve, we've been working on VR for a while, but we didn't start with trying to take the technology to market. Instead, we went straight into the experimentation, into research. We didn't care about the practical at first. We cared about the experience. So we started with tracking, because that's what we needed. At the time, we were looking at augmented reality or virtual reality. We eventually decided virtual reality was where it was at. And so the tracking system that was used in this room, we actually had the camera on the HMD. HMD or head-mounted display, the goggles. I'll use HMD a lot, and that's what that means. It's the headset. Right, so it had a camera on it looking outward at these traditionals on the walls. Now clearly, that's not a very commercial system. People aren't going to want to wallpaper their rooms like that. But this gave us back in 2013 room scale virtual reality with sub-millimeter level tracking. But once we had this, what we learned was the image was smearing heavily as you moved around looking. So then, before having this precise of tracking, you lived with that smearing, but you really noticed it when you had this good of tracking. So this became our method of working. You resolved one problem, tracking, to find the other problem that it was hiding, the smearing, and you repeat, and you keep getting closer and closer. So we worked on solving that, and that was with low persistence displays. At the time, the only way we could get those displays was we would buy mobile phones on eBay, tear off the panels, we'll call them panels, they're the displays, and then we would actually rip those out of the phone, hook them up to our own boards, our own circuit boards, and to drive them. And we were only using half of the panel, but we have two each because we had to globally display at the same time. And so now all high-end VR has low persistence, and I think all of them use two panels. I know Oculus does for sure, I'm not sure about Sony. Right, but so along with other, this is back in 2013, and along with other advances, is back then, the low persistence and the tracking that brought everyone to Seattle to see our room. Later we would build rooms for other companies that were trying to help succeed in VR. But at that time, we're still about research. Approaching it that way really freed us up. It let us do things like keep changing the tracking method and not worry about switching costs, because the only people paying that switching cost were our own internal developers. And so that's how we ended up with lasers and HTC. People always want to know how the two companies met. On the surface, it seems like an odd match. And while you can use cringeworthy words like synergy and alignment, the truth is much simpler. HTC was looking at and experimenting with VR. The chairwoman saw our demo and instantly knew she wanted to make it real. So much of the way the room changed the course for other companies, this time it changed the course for Valve and HTC. Instead of us being purely research, HTC would work with us on experimentation and our design to take those experiments and make them into a reality. So HTC is the reason that I'm here talking with you about virtual reality, the virtual reality that you can play out right now on the show floor and that you'll be able to have it in your homes really soon. So that's the history lesson. But for the rest of this talk, when we're discussing virtual reality, this is what I'm discussing, that level of high-end virtual reality. And since at Valve we've had it for years, we're now familiar, there's a lot of things that are familiar to us or obvious to us, but they may not be obvious or apparent to others. So let's try to clear up some of that confusion. Remember, all this is still really new, and we're still learning. Okay, so let's get down to some of the points we see coming up that confuse people. I was going to make a list, but number one on my list of things I hate is making lists, so there's no lists. All right, but if I don't cover something that confuses you, or you have some questions, there'll be a Q&A after the talk. You can go up to the microphone and ask me, or we'll be around all week at the Vive booth. All right, so the first thing you notice about high-end VR is the cable. You have that cable for a few reasons, but bandwidth is the biggest. So 90 times a second, we are pushing 2 HD screens worth of data down to the headset, the HMD. And we can't add latency or compression in the traditional sense. The problem with wireless technology is, a lot of the technology being made for VR is new, or we're using things in new ways. Wireless technology is actually a mature technology, so we're not going to see the rapid advancements there that we may see in other parts of the virtual reality system. So we don't think we're going to see all of a sudden the ability to stream a ton more bandwidth. Why theoretically this generation we can get close to what we need? Next generation, we're going to want to have 2K in each eye, or we're going to want to have 4K in each eye. So eventually what happens, my guess is that computers are just going to keep getting smaller and smaller. But there's some problems there as well, because you have battery life, heat, and other constraints. There's just a point where physics gets in the way of having that happen. So for now, high-end VR, you have a cable. And you're going to connect those cables to a beefy PC. Remember when I mentioned low persistence displays? So this is what low persistence really gives you. When you move your head, you're looking at exactly what you're looking at. And we do that because we flash the image globally, so all the pixels at once across both screens. And we do that for 1 millisecond, and then we turn it off for 9 milliseconds. So that means you're actually seeing black more than you're seeing light. But you don't notice it because we do that 90 times a second. So the panels are running at 90 megahertz, which means the content we send to those panels needs to run at 90 frames per second. So when you hear that 90 frames per second, that isn't some arbitrary number someone came up with. That's the physical number that you have to hit every single time. And it isn't actually even really 90 frames per second, because there's slack in the idea of 90 frames per second. It's really 90 times a second you hit G-Sync. You have to hit it on the beat. So that program really needs to be performant, so it needs to be connected to a high-end computer. But talking about hardware requirements is also kind of odd, because I can make something right now that runs on a 5-year-old video card. It's just going to be super simple and not very interesting. So when we're talking about system specs that you need now for virtual reality, what we're really doing is saying is, here's the minimum spec that most of the experiences will run at. And this allows then developers to target those cards and up for their experiences. So you don't get nice panels, the screens, that we're comfortable enough to look at for hours without the beefier computer. Besides visuals, audio is also very important in virtual reality. But there's a lot of confusion about audio in VR, in particular the phrase 3D positional audio. So first, let me make no mistake, the audio is very important to VR, and it's very important to us working on the Vive. I don't mean to dismiss it. We think about it, your brain uses audio all the time to help you understand a space, to help you navigate. That's super important, and it's super important to get it right. But I have some good news for you. 3D positional audio is nothing new. When we create experiences for VR, we almost always use a game engine. And what do game engines have since the 90s? 3D positional audio. First-person video games have simulated a listener, the camera, relative to a location-based sound for decades. Think footsteps in Counter-Strike. Right? These are important because they give you information about the world, orientation to left and right, and to distance. The misconception that 3D game audio won't work in VR is false. In fact, due to your ability to make for the listener to make small movements in their head very quickly, the 3D positional audio actually works, the game audio works better in VR than it does in the games. So right now, because all HMDs with positional tracking work with 3D game engines, they all have 3D positional audio capability by default, and it is up to the developer to utilize it correctly. All right, but binaural audio. So what binaural audio is it makes you hear the sound as if it was hearing it from your own ears. There's a very famous YouTube video of getting your hair cut that if you're listening with headphones, it sounds like someone's actually cutting your hair. So first, binaural audio is only relevant to the context of headphones. If you had no headphones, you'd make a room like this. A bunch of speakers that are all playing sounds out of the correct speakers so you positionally hear it. The problem with this is as you move around the room, the audio speakers would have to adjust for your movement in that room so it sounded correctly. And that'd get complicated. Second, binaural recordings. You can't record binaural audio in real life and use it in VR with positional tracking. Because when you record it, the sounds are set to the relative position you recorded them. And since in VR and games you can move and look freely, the moment you do that, the binaural recording will no longer reflect where the sound is coming from in the virtual space. Real-life binaural audio recordings will always reflect the angle and position at which they were captured and never respond to where the player is looking or moving. All right, so given that we can't use recorded binaural audio, we have to simulate binaural effects at runtime using software. What do I mean by simulating binaural effects? So I'm going to replicate the effect we're going for, because I'm going to play some white noise our sound designer Emily gave me while you look at the pictures of my cat and move your head around while listening. Now move your head around and see how the sound changes. Right? Do you get that? That's what we're trying to simulate and replicate in virtual reality. To do that, we use filters, binaural and HRTF filters to simulate this effect, which help us tell where the 3D audio is coming from. The weird thing is, so we've tried all the solutions. Some are better than others, and sometimes the untouched, raw, unfiltered positional audio is still better. But that's going to be now up to the developers to decide, do they want the processed audio, or do they want to use the unfiltered? So to condense all of this, 3D audio refers to sound sources within a 3D game engine that have an XYZ coordinates and respond dynamically based on where the player is looking or moving. All developers that work in 3D engines for VR are able to choose from a number of different software solutions to enhance the default 3D experiences. A little fun fact, 3D audio in games in VR is actually made up of a bunch of mono assets, not stereo. Why mono? Because we don't want to have any positional data baked into the asset. It'd be like baking in lighting or shadows into a model. So that's audio. Hopefully that makes some sense. Next up is input. The first time anyone goes into VR, they reach out for things. They want to touch. They want to interact with the world. The first time we had a track controller, it shocked us not just because it wasn't just additive, it was exponentially better. That when you can reach in, when you can interact with the world, your brain's belief in buying into that system grows that much stronger. And another thing we learned with early experiments is that you need to have low latency. We were surprised that how much latency latencycy affected input as well. It just wasn't head movement that makes you sick. But if you had low latency in your input, your body just didn't like the way it felt. So for input, we experimented and we talked with everybody. We also saw everything we could. We've had every type of input through our doors, so you need to keep an open mind in these fast-moving days. But it isn't by coincidence that Sony, Oculus, and ourselves have landed on somewhat similar input device for this first round of VR. Something you hold in your hand, is tracked and has input. I don't think anyone's going to say that's the end all of input, but it's a good starting point to get to the community and keep testing and exploring. And one of the reasons for now why it's the winning design, after much exploration, besides it working pretty well, it also has obvious failure cases. When you have a way of input, you want it to be something that works naturally without thinking about it, and if it fails, the user understands why. And so if you haven't tried these devices, you might be thinking Wiimotes, and you'd be wrong. Up to this point, games have really been about an abstraction. You're using imprecise controls, looking at a 2D screen, trying to control an avatar. But in virtual reality, you're in the scene with precise controls. It changes everything. And tracked input lets you affect the virtual world just like you do in the real world. And that's something we see with developers as they move from the 2D world to virtual reality, is sometimes how you open a door is you open a door. And it's kind of mind-blowing of how simple that works. So let's cover some of the other input methods people discuss. Eye tracking. Your eyes do an amazing job of looking around and interpreting the world for you. But how often do you think, let me look at that, and then just move your eyes, not your head, to look at something? I'm going to guess not that often. And if you do it now for the next 10 minutes while you're bored listening to me, you're going to find out it's also really fatiguing. And at this moment, it's also problematic. We've seen failures because people have too long of eyelashes, because somebody had LASIK, or it just fails. And much like a lot of the tech here, it keeps getting better. Every time we see it, it's better and better. And it's going to be really interesting to see where it goes in the coming years, especially for things like foveated rendering. But as input, it just isn't how we interact with the real world. We're used to touching things, physically interacting. But in the real world, you do know where someone is looking. And that's important for social interactions. So right now, we can track where your head's pointing, but we can't track where your eyes are pointing. And so that may become an important part of what eye tracking does for us in those social interactions. You can control your computer right now with voice. There's software that does it, so why don't you? I mean, for me, personally, I find it tiring and inept and get better over time as we yell at our TVs, consoles, and phones. But for now, it's inconsistent, and it's not good at precise controls and not how we interact in the real world. It also raises one other thing to think about when you're thinking about input. Commanding something with your voice is a cognitive. You have to think about what you're saying before you say it. And that ends up pulling you out of the experience. That breaks natural, something you stop thinking about. It's being tracked. Well, maybe in the future, but we aren't. In that classic Hollywood shot, those arms straight out, interacting like that, some groups actually use that as punishment. Try it for 10 minutes just holding your arms outside there. You get what they call gorilla arms. It's exhausting. And one of the amazing things you notice when you first start experimenting with input, your hands do a lot of things without you ever looking at them, right? You can write things, you can steer a car, you can shift gears, you open doors. All of that happens without you looking at them. So if you're tracking your hands, you need to track them wherever they are, not just when you're looking at them. And also, for a current round of input, by holding something, we can also have haptic feedback. It's something about when you reach out and you touch something, holding one of the current controllers, and you feel that little touch, that makes it so much more real. Your brain expects it, and when it gets that payoff, it's just happy. So you want to have that as well. But to step back to the tracked input again, it isn't just about buttons. It's about interactions. You can see the arrows. Most people we don't even need to tell. And if we do need to tell someone, we only need to tell them once. They're in the quiver behind you. You just reach back and you pull it out, and it's there. It's not about buttons for input. It's not about hitting the reload key. It's about doing something physical in the world that your body understands is right. And your body instantly gets used to it, and it's a really great way of input. But it also shows the beginning of what people will start doing as we start getting more and more familiar with this. Again, this is all so new for developers that they're just learning these kind of tricks. So now on to movement. The first thing people think of for virtual reality is the holodeck. You run around in your virtual world. There are problems with that. I mean, our current set of movements where you're pushing a joystick forward or hitting on the W key end up getting you nauseous. They're the easiest way to get somebody sick. So, one of the first things that influenced our choice for the room scale back when we had the few dishes on the wall, you could take a new gamer, you could take a hardcore gamer, and you could say, go over there to that model that's 2 feet away. And everyone knew how to do it. They just walked over there. There was no hitting of buttons. There was no pushing of anything. You would just walk over, kneel down, and inspect it. It was very natural to you. And in VR, you physically react when you see something larger than life, right? You step back, you move, you physically react to it. When you tap into VR, which has presence, your body wants to participate in it. One of the coolest things I've seen recently was playing something that's not announced yet. And it's a stealth game, and you're moving around, and I peered around a corner to see what was in the other room. I did that by peering around a corner. That was it. And it's one of those things you do it, and you're like, well, yeah, of course, you peered around a corner. But I've never peered around a corner before in a game. I've always pushed on some combination of keys, held some key down while I hit the S key. There's this moment when I realized what I was doing that as a game designer, my head kind of exploded with the possibilities of what we're really getting ourselves into. Okay, so that's localized motion in room scale. And to be clear, I want one takeaway from this talk, if nothing else. In that room, you can go up to 5 meter by 5 meter, but that's the maximum. Okay? That is not the requirement. Right now, you can walk over to our booth or to Frontier's booth, and you can play Elite Dangerous sitting down. So room scale VR isn't the requirement that you have a 5 meter by 5 meter room. It can scale all the way from sitting to that large. Okay? So I'm going to repeat it one more time, because there's a lot of confusion about this. Room scale VR does not replace the other VR. It's additive to it. You don't need the 5 meter by 5 meter room. We know most people don't have that much room in their house. So it supports everything in between. So why room scale then? Besides the localized motion, when you watch things, when you listen to things, what do? Like today, you're sitting in a seat. Your body through years of training equates sitting with watching. You stand up, move around, you stretch, you're ready for the action. And part of it is your body is also scared because now it feels vulnerable. You're standing out there. There's nothing protecting you. You're active in the scene. And this time, because now it's exposed, you're standing in the center of the action, this time literally, not figuratively like most game ads would have you believe. And I give myself 50-50 that I used the word literally correctly there. Okay, so back to movement. Movement outside of your play area changes things. These are the early days of experimenting and trying things to see what works. All VR systems are experimenting with what this looks like. This isn't just a problem for room scale VR. And one of our main thoughts is you don't mimic the real world. So this is what Hollywood did. This is the movie Disclosure. And so Michael Douglas puts on the VR gear, steps on a contraption. He's going to look a file, and he actually has to do it quickly. And so he does it quickly by walking down these cavernous halls to the file cabinet room, where he opens the door, walks down into the room to the file cabinet, where he opens up the file cabinet, pages through, picks up the file, opens it up, and shoot me. That is a horrible UI. It's a horrible interface. VR lets us do new things, not mimic the old things. And so one of the things that's going to happen is, as people try these different ways of movement, as they try to see what works, because it's going to keep changing over the years, you in the community will have an impact on the future of VR, and that's important. This isn't like going from one console to another where it's a visual upgrade or a slightly different control scheme. This is a fundamental different experience. We're all learning this together. So, it's so different that before we meet somebody to talk about working with them in virtual reality, we make them see the demo, because there's a different conversation after they see the demo. When you get a chance to try it yourself, hopefully, here at the show, give us feedback. Tell us what you want. Tell us what you want to see. And this isn't about us versus them. We're all working in this together and with the developers to make sure that VR succeeds. So tell everyone. Oh. I'm missing a slide. All right, I don't know what happened there. Okay, so locomotion lends itself to the next problem. That's where we see the most often is people getting nauseous. Okay, and the idea that VR must get you sick is BS. We have a bunch of people who will come in for demos who don't want to do demos. There'll always be somebody, like if there's a party of 10 people come in, there'll be someone who's like, oh, I can't do this, I'll get sick, I can't do this. That's because of expectations of either of what they've seen before or what they've heard. So as consumers, as people who are going to purchase this, as people in the community, hold it. It's no longer the hardware's fault anymore. It's the developers making choices that are getting you sick. So tell them that you don't want that. Okay, so now on to 360 video. So this is a hot topic right now, and with a lot of excitement and investment around it. 360 video went from something you checked out on your computer monitor to meaning VR. But for VR that supports positional tracking, it runs into the same problems we have with binaural audio. While the rigs can be complicated and look like something out of a sci-fi movie, they're just recording the events from a single point of view. So think of it. If you wanted a 360 video of this talk, you can put a camera right there. It'd be a really nice view. If you're on your computer screen, you could look and you'd scan the crowd as well, and it'd be a neat experience. But if you view it in VR with positional tracking, and you move your head to the left, you expect to see more information. You expect to see more things about the right side of my head. But if you right, and so right now, if you all lean to your left, right, you're going to see more information. And people further back in the room will see less information. People towards the front will see more information. And that's why a lot of 360 videos film from 7 to 10 feet away without getting close, because they're trying to hide that problem. But the thing is, in virtual reality, you want to get close to things. You want to inspect things. You want to hold them. It's just, it just makes it magical when you're able to do that. The other problem is you expect to see movement back to you. So if you're looking at 360 video, and it works actually oddly well in headsets where you don't have positional tracking, because you don't expect to see those things reflected back to you. But with positional tracking, you expect when I move my head like this, I should see what I see moving my head. When you don't, that's when you can get nausea, and that's when you can get sick. So how do we fix this? How do we capture live action where you can see all the different angles? I don't know. There's a lot of companies chasing it, and but it still isn't there yet. And people keep saying things like filming in VR when they really mean filming in 360 video. So it's a really confusing time for right now. But to be clear, you can capture 3D data now. Valve's own Adam Foster just did a great blog post on steamvr.com about photogrammetry. You go look it up. Sorry, jet lag. I'm blaming that one on jet lag. It's a process that lets you take a bunch of photos using just a regular camera of an area, and then you recreate the scene in VR, and it actually lets you walk around and move in that scene. You can get close to things. You see the parallax as you get close and move around it. So this is a shot from that. This is from our offices, and then they put Peabody inside of our office. So you can scan sets, scenes, areas, and recreate them to walk around in them, like you can do in that scene. Adam even went to Iceland and scanned a bunch of physical nature scenes and did the same thing. And it's really believable. You think you're there. Your body buys into it because all the ways you're used to seeing information reflected back to you. It's time-consuming. But one of the things you don't see in it is live action, humans moving. Right, which is kind of the classic thing a lot of people say of VR is they're going to put that camera down and right on the pitch, and you're going to be able to see the entire game in 360 and move your view everywhere. We're not there yet, right? It's time-consuming to capture soft human shapes and motion. And when you need all the data from all the angles, so we're just still not seeing that happening yet. But then there's things like what Lionsgate, Starbreeze, and Weaver are doing for the upcoming John Wick experience, where they have a full 3D scan of Lance Reddick, who plays the hotel manager from the movie. There's no video tricks. You're in the room with him. You can get close, you can check him out, you can walk around him. But the cool thing is, a scary thing really, is he knows you're checking him out, and he reacts to it. And so it's a little intimidating as he starts to feel like a real person in the room with you. And they did the work, though, to get that right. There's a full body scan, they got motion capture, his voice, it all works together to create one of the most amazing characters in VR to date. I can't wait till people get to check it out for themselves. Once you start seeing characters like this and full room scanning, it's hard to go back to simple 360 video. But maybe that acts as a gateway content for people with HMDs that don't support positional tracking, or maybe this is one of those things where the community will decide what is more important, fidelity or access. So what other questions are there? I'm going to quickly go through some of them, the common ones we hear. VR isn't social. First, that's like saying games aren't social. Right? You don't play Team Fortress or League with friends. Games are already social. The cool thing is that VR actually amplifies that. No longer are you looking at each other's avatars abstractly, but you get to see each other's real movements and all the information and context that goes with that. And it can also be social locally, with games like Fantastic Contraption pictured here. Right? Watching your friends try to solve the puzzles and egg them on with their crazy ideas is a sport of its own. Some other quick points. All games will now be VR games. No, VR is additive. It is another platform from games, but this doesn't mean an end to the traditional games that you're used to. Not every good game makes a good VR game. It will take forever to set up each time you play. Not true. I can use our own setup, for example. You set up and define your play area once, and then bam, you're good to go. Any other time you want to play, you just pick up the HMD and pick up the controllers, and you're ready to play. If you die in virtual reality, you die in reality. Yes, this is the one thing Hollywood got right. All experiences will be short mini games in VR. No, there's full games being made, but what you're seeing is one of the problems as we try to demo VR is we have a limited number of kits at a show, so you do short experiences. But there'll be a wide range of experiences at launch. Ask Kid anything about that dying in VR thing a few slides back. Your bodies are already dead, and you're just brains living in glass jars. You're in virtual reality right now, and you don't know it. 3D TV failed, so VR will fail. 3D TV didn't change the way you experienced content. Virtual reality fundamentally changed the experience. It's a poor comparison. We have talked about immersive experiences before. We have talked about interaction before. But never before did we break through the fourth wall and put you in the scene. This really does change everything. We will adjust and get used to it. It won't be special after time. I can only speak for myself for familiarity. And I know this. Presence still strong enough for me that when I'm ducking behind a desk, I have to remind myself not to put my hand up on that desk as I get back up, because I'll fall down. You know, that part of your brain, that lizard brain that keeps you alive now, it stops you from walking in front of cars. It keeps you sitting on that chair. You know, the VR taps into that. It taps into that lizard brain. And for me, I continue to buy into VR every day. Oh, by the way, don't be smug about your brain being in a fancy glass jar. Those are just marinated hors d'oeuvres for the world's future inhabitants. And you need a dedicated space for it. So I'm going to thank Cliff Blazinski for this. He has a whole Tumblr on bad memes of why VR is going to fail. And I borrowed this one from him. Because he's right? Do you have a special place for your gaming computer, your console, your TV, that treadmill that you don't use? It can scale from being just on your desk next to your monitor to a dedicated room for it. But remember, what is the one takeaway from this talk I want you to have? You don't need a 5 meter by 5 meter room. That is currently the maximum. And it's actually going to get bigger. But it's not a requirement. And so that's it. I can stop talking at you, and instead we can have a conversation about this. If there isn't time for your question here, or if you also hate standing up and talking in front of people as much as I do, I'll be hanging around afterwards, or you can come over to the Vive demo area and chat with me. So if you want to ask a question, there's a microphone there. Oh, fancy.
I actually wrote this down so I don't muddle my words. Okay. So you briefly touched upon it, the idea of isolation and that it's not a social activity. So I think... Oh, sorry. Okay. Is that better?
Yes.
Right. Gaming has become a continually isolated pastime, in my opinion, compared with tabletop D&D or local co-op consoles. VR seems to emphasize this isolation. Is that another failure case?
No, actually, I think, as I said in the one slide, besides the local VR, which Fantastic Contraption is just really fun. The first time I played it, there was like 20 people behind me all laughing at my continuous failure. But to say that it's isolating is you go over your friend's house every night and play D&D. You know, for me, I play a game almost every night. I'm addicted to Battlefield 4. I play Team Fortress on 2 Fort every night because it's the only map that matters. But I play those on certain servers with certain people and interact with them. And so I think that argument normally comes from old guys like me who aren't social about their gaming already, but I think gaming itself is social. And VR really does help that. Of when you see somebody else doing this when you're talking with them, you're like, all right. It's the normal social interactions you have, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, I might clarify a point in terms of physical isolation versus, ability to communicate and so on, but actually physically being isolated from other people in the same room, for instance.
I mean, when you put the headset on, you're concentrating on that. I mean, that's for sure. But like I said, when you're doing something like Fantastic Contraption, you can hear what other people are saying and laughing at you. Actually, one of the more interesting things on that's the flip side of it that I don't think people think about is right now, when you're watching a movie at home, are you on your phone? Are you on your iPad? Are you essentially splitting your time between a lot of things? So I think a lot of content's become shallower because of that. When you have TV shows, you have reality TV shows, which is just garbage. And your mind can just sit there and not have to worry and follow along because it's going to be so obvious and so big. But VR brings you back to a place where you're concentrating on things, where you're focused on them in a way you haven't been for a really long time. And I think that's going to be interesting to explore as people are able to do kind of more in-depth, more mature content of talking about and exploring ideas like empathy, where you are in that space and you're in that space long enough that you buy into it. not to say it was a deep experience, but for GDC we had a fishing game by, oh come on, the guys who make Rail Sim, Dovetail Gaming. And I would go in the morning and I would play the games nervously, as trying to go through and make sure everything was good for GDC. And there'd be points where I'd play the fishing game for so long because it was relaxing that I was sure the controller I was holding was a fishing pole. And that for the next demo, I was going to have to get rid of the fishing pole because there's no way I could poke the things I needed to poke because the fishing pole is too long. My brain was so far gone that I had to take the headset off and look at the controller and then put it back on. To do that with something as simple as that is going to be interesting to do something where we're actually wanting you to feel something, wanting you to understand what it's like to be somebody or be in their shoes. And so I think those possibilities become really interesting in a way that other mediums don't allow us to explore.
Thank you so much, and thanks for a really thought-provoking talk.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to be a bit greedy here and ask 2 questions. One, is Half-Life 3 going to be in VR?
We were kind of betting if that was going to get asked. No.
And 2, aren't the cables going to limit the ability to interact with the movement as you turn? Because when I've tried the Oculus Rift out, given it a go and everything, headset on, and you always find when you get to a certain point, obviously the cables are going to limit that. Are you eventually going to try and do wireless, or is it just...
Well, like I said, wireless just has a lot of problems. I mean, do people understand that point I was making about that? Is wireless has been around for a long time. There's a lot of people who want wireless to be faster and more data. That problem's people have been on. There's a bunch of other problems like the panels and the tracking that are all new to VR, and so we'll see those kind of take off in a different way. But wireless is going to be really hard. And so what we've seen is, so the controllers are wireless, and they let you have input, where you can kind of be free that way. And the cable will actually get thinner. And once you do it enough, you kind of get this cable management in your head, where it becomes less of an issue. We see the issue with the cable more when it's somebody new or it's somebody in the demo for the first time. But as you get more and more used to it, I regularly am in long sessions doing a lot of things like fantastic contraption you move around a lot in, and the cable becomes a non-issue.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, well, thanks.
I mean, to be clear, we wish there was no cable, but there's just the physical limits.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. You didn't answer my first question, though.
I said no.
Hi, I've also got 2 questions. Don't worry, nothing about halfway through. Is there any limitation to how long you can actually use the VR headsets? Like, can I actually go on for like 3-hour sessions, or is it like only for 1 hour before your mind gets a bit confused?
Well, so there's 2 things. One is it'd be fatigue, visual fatigue. In some of the early headsets, you would get a real visual fatigue where you just had to stop.
Yeah.
The good thing with low persistence is, well, you have low persistence and you have a focus length that goes on for infinity. It's actually more relaxing than almost looking like this is. So that fatigue doesn't set in. And then it's as long as you want to go in there. We have some people looking at, like, is there some sweet spot or not, or what? But we've had experiences that are long. I've spent hours in. Besides thinking I'm holding a fishing rod, things seem fine.
Oh, that's good. The other question is, I'm not sure if it was asked, but will there be a point where the whole body will be able to be seen in the virtual reality? So, like, I can stare at my hand and you can actually see it move my fingers.
So that's that's kind of like the perfect world that a lot of people are looking at. And really what it comes down to right now is tracking all of that in real time without latency. So even something like the Move, which does a nice job of tracking a lot of your body, there's a latency in there you don't notice because it's on a 2D screen that you're looking at versus you physically moving and playing around with it. And so that's where it becomes problematic. But that's the kind of I'm projecting out, and that's what I was saying. So what's
also when it's like if you're gonna hold something hard and holding like something furry, then how you can actually feel those, are you? And it's like you can have pads, but I don't think you really can actually take any changes between the views we get.
But it may be once we get full body tracking that you're like, hey, that's fine, I don't have haptics. I actually still prefer that better. And that's what I was saying is a lot of this is coming down to, I mean, there's a lot of lip service always said to, oh, community, we're really looking to you. But no, I mean, seriously, people are going to decide. People are going to decide what experiences they like. People are going to decide what input they like. Right? This is all going to be out there now for the community to decide because this is so different than anything else. We don't know, right? We've used it a bunch. We've made a bunch of choices based on our usage. We've purposely given it out to a bunch of people at work, have them at home. Everyone at Valve goes through the demos. Like, you know, we've gotten thousands and thousands of people through the demos, and all of those demos are play tests to see what people like and what they want. And so, you know, some of those questions we'll find out just based on how people react and what they choose.
Lovely, thank you.
Thanks. Well,
that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. Thanks very much for coming, and thank you to Chet from Valve.